while I do it. Is that successful? Is my screen shared? You can see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Right, I'll just put it into slideshow mode then. There you go. I think that should be fine. Right, so I want to thank Universal Design Initiative for Africans for inviting me to speak at this webinar today. I think it's really very exciting to have universal design coming into Africa and to see its application then in terms of inclusive education. So I have called my input on a variation on the theme, an overview of inclusive education in Africa, including universal design for learning. So it's including UDL in inclusive education. And I'm from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and I am in the Division of Disability Studies there. And I'm the director of a research unit called Including Disability and Education in Africa. So you can see why I'm excited to be here. This is really part of what our agenda is. So let's just start off then by looking at understanding inclusion in education. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think that there is a lot of literature and there's a lot of information that you can find around inclusive education. I'm not going to begin with the idea that inclusion is about including children with disabilities in mainstream, but rather to think about a broader definition of inclusion. And here I'm going to draw on Roger Slee in the preparatory report for the GEM report, Roger Slee 2020, who defines inclusion like this. It's securing the right of all children to access, presence, participation, and success in their local schools. Which schools build their capacity to eliminate barriers to provide excellent educational experiences and outcomes for all children and young people. And you will note there that it's not only children with disabilities, it's all children, that schools become available to all children. And what is nice for me about this definition is it's not only about access, but it is about participation and also about success. So it's not just being in the classroom, it's participating and achieving. Inclusion is about providing all students of the relevant age range with an equitable and participatory learning experience and environment. All students have chances to succeed. And also inclusion is a systemic reform. It's not something that can just happen in one classroom. It has to embody changes and modifications in content, teaching methods, approaches, structures, and strategies in education to overcome barriers. So it is a change in the whole system. It's not just a change for one person. And then importantly, I think we just need to have a quick think about what is not inclusion. And what is not inclusion is placing students with disabilities within mainstream classes without necessary support. And the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities makes it clear that integration does not guarantee the transition from segregation to inclusion. Because a child is integrated into a school, that doesn't mean that they might not be segregated in certain ways. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that when I come to the examples that I want to share with you. So the Global Education Monitoring Report of 2020, which is the report that gives report back on the Sustainable Goal 4, an inclusive and equitable quality education for all. They released their report on inclusive education, and the title of that report is Inclusion and Education, All Means All. And those capital letters are not mine, those capital letters are from the report itself. And what they putting forward in this report, which really does provide us with some global direction in this regard, is that inclusive education involves a process that contributes to the goal of social inclusion. So I think for me, the really important word to pick up here is a process. Inclusive education is a process. It's not necessarily an outcome. It's something that we aspire to, it's something that we're working towards, and it's something that we are continually improving on and getting more improved. So it has to do with delivering sufficient, differentiated, and individualized support. And that requires perseverance, resilience, and a long-term perspective. So whereas people might say, oh, inclusion won't work, well, and inclusion isn't going to work, what this report is asking us to do is to go in with the mindset that, yes, inclusion does work, but that's not to say that it isn't difficult. And it's not to say that it will happen quickly. And it's not to say that it will happen smoothly. And that's why we're encouraged to have perseverance, resilience, and a long-term perspective. So I think for me, that's very important. And then thirdly, that the process of addressing and responding to the diversity of needs is for all children, youth, and adults. It's not only learners with disabilities who are excluded through discriminatory mechanisms. So inclusion is about all marginalized children, whether that be as a result of poverty, disability, illness, refugee status, and so on. So it is about all children. However, I'm going to say that in this presentation, I am somewhat more focused on children with disabilities, but I am looking at the inclusion of children with disabilities within an overall inclusive education system. So I just want to be clear about that. We are fully aware, and it is very important to understand that it's much broader than disability, but it does not mean that we can't consider disability within that inclusive system. So just in terms of inclusive education in Africa, I'm going back to the GEM report here to give a very brief overview of where we are, because I don't think we want to spend a lot of time on a background, an African background. I think I would like to really go into examples as soon as possible. But what I would like to say is that sub-Saharan African countries have largely taken steps towards policies that do support inclusion. And the report states that 42% of countries in the region are considered to be pursuing inclusive policies. And they say a coherent approach to inclusion remains a challenge. So while there is a shift towards inclusion, what does inclusion mean? Does it mean the same thing in each of these countries? What is the gap between policy and between implementation? And what are the operational arrangements that are made? For example, in some countries, education for children with disabilities remains under social development as opposed to being in the education system. And that works against inclusive education as such. So that's just a background. But in order to, I thought what would be nice for us to do today is to look at specific examples of research that has been done, and just to gather from this the findings of what experiences are on inclusion in Africa, and then look at this in the light of universal design for learning, so that we have some kind of reality to work with. So the first one I'd like to mention is Dr. soon-to-be, Dr. Kofi Nsebo, who is from Ghana, who carried out his research with us at UDIA and at the University of Cape Town. And his research was around exploring the experiences of children and youth with mobility impairments in 4 basic educational settings in Ghana. And what he found is that Ghana has good education policies. There's quite a lot of inclusive education policy, and there even is, as far as I know, there's mention of universal design for learning in the education policy. But he found that this is not reflected in practice in the 4 basic educational settings that he looked at, which is the special school, mainstream school, rehabilitation center, and inclusive schools. Throughout all of these, children with disabilities continue to experience stigma and inaccessible environments. And within some of the schools, for example, the rehabilitation center, they do not have access to the general curriculum and therefore not able to progress academically. So that is a form of exclusion, even though the education system is supposedly inclusive. So the outcome of his research was the development of an inclusive schooling practices framework. And within this framework, universal design for learning will facilitate the implementation to minimize barriers and to maximize learning for all children. Sorry, it just doesn't want to progress the slide. We've got it. So the second study I'd just like to report on is a study that is currently being carried out in Cameroon by Bridget Longla-Fobuzi. And her study is investigating how the learning needs of students with vision disability are understood and accommodated within mainstream schools. This is a work in progress. It's still in the early days, but these are just some of the thoughts that Bridget shared with us. She said capacity development for pre and in-service teachers is crucial when she's been looking at these schools, including children with vision disability. Family involvement and support is indispensable, and parents and caregivers need to have a deep understanding of their child's disability in order to provide support. So I think that's really an important one for our discussion of inclusive education, is that we need to understand what we mean by disability, and we need to understand families and how they experience disability and be able to provide them the support that they need. Inclusive education is feasible if the right supports are put in place, and she has seen some of this happening in the school, which is inclusive. Inclusive teaching and learning practices result in good and effective teaching, which benefits all students. So where some of the teachers in these schools have actually undergone training in inclusive education, she has noticed an improvement in their teaching practice, and this enriches the educational landscape. And then the third study I want to mention is one carried out by Dr. Mani Karissa on understanding father involvement in the education of learners with intellectual disability in a special school in Kenya, a case study. And what he found is fathers want us being, I suppose, the establishment, the education system, to appreciate that placing disabled learners in the same classroom with non-disabled learners might not be enough. So it's not just the access that is needed. What is needed is if inclusive education still maintains a rigid curriculum, then this will not support their children. So they're not saying we can't just put our children into regular schools. It's not just about access, because how will that curriculum meet their needs? And they advocate for more fundamental changes in the traditional schooling system that will lead to recognition of the individual strengths and weaknesses of learners, rather than relying on rigid instructional strategies. And you'll see that this finding clicks very well with our discussion on universal design on learning that we will go into. Then the last one I wanted to mention was the Teacher Empowerment for Disability Inclusion project at the University of Cape Town, which was the predecessor IDEA research unit. And what I wanted to just note from here in our research is where we asked learners with disabilities about what their needs are in an inclusive education system. And they came up with their needs as being impairment-specific adaptations to the curriculum. They need to be able to have access and engagement with the curriculum according to their disability. They need access to assistive technology. That means not only having access to a Braille machine, but also knowing how to work it, for one example. Appropriate language and media for learning and teaching. That includes sign language, Braille, alternative and augmentative communication. They need social and psychological support. Disability remains stigmatized, and often living with disability is not easy, and people need that support. And then addressing additional barriers to learning. Just because a child has a disability doesn't mean that they don't have other barriers to learning, such as those that related to poverty or to chronic illness or other issues. So that's the kind of some examples, which is really not comprehensive at all. It's just a few examples of the kind of research that we are doing. And I'm now just going to move into the universal design component of this. And here, the Universal Design Initiative in Africa will be starting from this kind of premise of universal design. So universal design, I think, and I can be corrected by the UDIA, but I believe it started in the architecture field, in building. And universal design talks about the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed understood and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. So any environment should be designed to meet the needs of all the people who wish to use it. It shouldn't be seen as a special requirement, but a fundamental condition of good design. So, for example, let's take a staircase going into a building versus a ramp going into a building. The ramp is accessible to a person using a wheelchair, as well as possibly people, a woman pushing a pram, an elderly person using a walker, even possibly skateboarders, but we won't go there. Whereas a staircase, if it were to be accessible to a person in a wheelchair, you might have to then modify it again after the staircase has been built by like doing a little lift. And you've seen sometimes they get these staircase lifts, but the ramp would be the preferable solution because that would have been thought of before and would have met the needs before. And also it's likely to be less expensive. The other example is closed captioning on TV, which obviously is of benefit to people with hearing impairment, but also, when you don't understand the accent of the people that are talking, or other reasons as well. So what does that mean? Universal design for learning, which we call UDL, applies these principles to learning and designs a learning environment and curriculum to meet the needs of the widest range of learning styles. And the really revolutionary thing about it is that it requires planning upfront rather than retrofitting. So like I say about the ramp versus the lift going up the stairs, the ramp is planning beforehand for the different people that will be coming into the building. The lift on the steps is retrofitting when you find out that something's not working. And that principle then applies in learning as well. Instead of having to modify in the classroom and change and to make adaptations that might be difficult to do once you're in the classroom, you think about it beforehand. So it meets a wider range of needs from the start. There's no such thing as the average learner. We all learn differently. I think teachers will recognize that they are often teach to the middle of the class, and then there are the students that are on advanced and the students that are slow. But UDL reminds us that there is no such thing as the average learner. We all learn differently. Our task then within UDL as educators using UDL is finding, honoring, and using different ways to learn. It's addressing many variables involved in learning. It's about honoring the fact that all persons have different strengths and learning styles. And it's engaging the learner, supporting personal choice, and recognizing the diversity of learning styles and approaches. And what the value of universal design for learning then is that everyone has access to learning in a way that works for them. So even your middle of the road student might find that they actually do better when they have their learning style acknowledged and used in the classroom. It supports a shift in practice so that teachers begin to value variability. As it is now, teachers often find inclusion difficult to deal with because they say, for example, I have a big class, I have a lot of students, and now you want me to bring in students with disability. What they're implying is that in the big class, those children that are allowed to be in there are somehow the same. And if you bring in a child with disability, you bring in somebody who is different. And now they're going to have to do more. Usually they assume it will be more for this child who's different. But when we're looking at UDL, we would be starting off from the principle that all of the children in the class are different from each other. And then values and plans for diversity. So you start off planning for diversity rather than saying, oh no, here comes diversity, it means trouble. And challenges the myth of the average learner, as I've just mentioned. The other advantage of universal design is that everyone benefits. So if a lesson is adapted such that there's visual and auditory and text support, then all children benefit because they might be stronger in one or the other, and they get the option to use the channel that works best for them. The other way in which everyone benefits is when I'm just going to go through the principles quickly in a minute. is that it does provide a language that we can talk together, teachers to parents, health professionals who might be involved. It gives quite a nice way of sharing communication. So these are the principles of UDL, and I'm going to just go through each of them. It's really just a whistle-stop tour. Please make use of the excellent websites. If you Universal Design for Learning, search Universal Design for Learning, and the Center for Assistive Special Technology CAST is the organization. That's the organization that the idea originated with. And they've got wonderful learning materials. So I'm just doing this as an introduction. This is the beginning of your finding out more. So it begins with providing multiple means of representation, and that entails presenting. So there are 3 principles, and they're quite simple, these principles. They are like getting information in, allowing the learner to engage with the information and then expressing it. So the first one is providing multiple means of representation, presenting information and content in different ways. And this involves providing options for perception, for example, visual and auditory. There's no point writing on a chalkboard for a classroom of blind children. You have to have different options that would work. On the other hand, it's no point in using only sign language in a class that has children who are deaf and those who are hearing, and the ones who are hearing have not learned sign language yet. Whereas if they have, that would be an option. Provide options for language and symbols. This means different languages, different symbols. Apologies for that background noise. There's a truck going by. And then provide options for comprehension. This is comprehension by scaffolding and building on background knowledge, which teachers will recognize that they use some of these techniques already, but this is just a way of putting them comprehensively. Provide multiple means of action and expression. That's differentiate the way the students can express what they know. Often it's the assessment and evaluation that really stumps teachers. How will I know that they know? How will I know that they can actually understand the content? And here, some of the options are to provide options for physical action. There might be ways of expressing using body, using other physical means, using multiple media for communication, and providing options for executive functions in their planning and how they actually plan to express themselves. And then principle 3 is multiple means of engagement, which involves stimulating interest and motivation for learning. And in this, one would be concerned to recruit interest, make sure that the students are interested, sustaining their effort and persistence, that they can carry on with the task, and also self-regulation, so that they learn to control their own behavior and to complete and to do the work that they need to do. So the last concept I want to introduce is, so basically the concept that we're looking at is inclusive education, universal design for learning, and reasonable accommodation. And this is reasonable accommodation, which if we have disability activists in the room, they will be very familiar with. And reasonable accommodation is used in the United Nations Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities. And it's about ensuring that specific support needs in the education context, specific support needs of learners with disabilities are provided for so that they're able to equitably participate in learning alongside their peers. And so there need to be specific accommodations. It doesn't mean that like all deaf children need to have hearing aids, for example. It means that each child needs to have accommodations. If they have a specific impairment that is a barrier to their learning, then the reasonable accommodation must be suited to their situation and relevant to the context in which they're working. So reasonable accommodation is about those additional support needs that might not be catered for in universal design for learning. So inclusive education, as we've said, is about participation in all learning and in social activities, and it's about success academically and socially. Enrollment or access is not enough. And our participation and success depend on having good quality teachers who make good use of basic teaching skills, which can be, as we've argued here, those basic teaching skills can be enhanced by universal design for learning. And then also addressing other barriers that might prevent learners from participating and achieving. Whereas UDL can create an environment that caters to diversity, there are additional supports that might be needed in reasonable accommodation that enable equitable participation of children with specific impairments. So what I'm suggesting is both UDL and reasonable accommodation are needed for inclusive, equitable, and quality education. CBM and International NGO talks about a twin track approach where there's universal design for learning, which is about making systemic changes so that everyone is included. But this is accompanied by reasonable accommodation, which is making appropriate adjustments to support individual needs. And these reasonable accommodation needs might be very specific, and they might also, in some cases, be costly. For example, a motorized wheelchair with is a costly accommodation that might be needed. And then just before closing, I wanted to just give some lovely reflections from our colleague in Cameroon, who is actually a teacher and who's using UDL in her practice. And she likes using UDL because she says it helps her to ask thought-provoking questions during lesson planning and preparation, leading her to develop her key questions. So she's thinking about representation, expression, and engagement in her lesson planning. She says the UDL makes it easier for teachers to understand inclusion because they can understand diversity. She says, access has become my watchword as I plan, prepare, and teach my students. Will all the students in the class that I'm teaching have access to this material that I'm presenting? She says it enabled me to move away from the one-size-fits-all chalk and talk model of teaching and learning. And the availability of choice means all learners are engaged during lessons. It enabled me to know my students more and to focus on their strengths. So that I would like to conclude there. Those are the contact details, and then there's just some of the websites that one might use for more information on Universal Design for Learning. I hope I haven't exceeded my time. I thought I had a few minutes because we started a little bit late, but apologies if I have. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Judith. Amazing work. I'll welcome Tobiloba to take us on her presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to be sure that everyone can hear me while I queue up my slides.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. All right. So I will be sharing my slides shortly. Let's see. Do I have permission to share my slides? All right. Thanks so much, Dr. Judith. And just for the record, I have taken your course on Future Learn on inclusive education, and I absolutely loved it from a practice perspective. So thank you so much for that, because you just gave me a lot to go on. All right, I don't think that I have permission to share my screen, so somebody needs to give me permission to do that. But while I'm waiting for that, I'll get started. So today I'm going to be talking about inclusive education in Nigeria, but not from the research perspective like Dr. Judith did, but I'll be talking about it from an experiential and anecdotal perspective. So I live with cerebral palsy, and now that I think about it, I was privileged to be educated inclusively in Nigeria throughout my entire childhood and basically throughout my education up until the Nigerian law school. For a very long time, I thought that was typical for all students with disabilities. I didn't realize how much of an outlier that I was until 2016, where after I shared my story and other parents started to reach out to say, oh, we're also in Nigeria. How did you get an inclusive education? And at that point, I started to research because I was a bit confused, right? How did we get here? I mean, this is the same me who had gone, into schools. I mean, fine, thinking about it now, it was more integration than inclusion, but at least I was well. Now they were in 2016, children with disabilities were not even welcome. It was especially children with cerebral palsy, which is the condition that I'm focused on, where they were clearly just out. They were not welcome in mainstream schools. And I was shocked because I had the privilege of being able to compare and contrast for my own generation, those of us with cerebral palsy who had been in mainstream schools versus those who had been in segregated settings. And of course, the outcomes were completely different. So to see that we had gone from a country that was willing to at least integrate to a country who was becoming completely segregationist, I started to ask questions. Um, so I started to ask my older siblings questions. Okay, when you were going to schools in the 70s, what was happening? What happened in the 1990s, the early 2000s? How did we get here from 2000 to date? What's holding us back from inclusion and what can we do next? So I'm just going to run us through all of that from my own lens and from my own experience, and also from the work that I now do at the Let Cerebral Palsy Kids Learn Foundation, where we work to promote inclusive education for children with cerebral palsy in Nigeria. So let's see, what was inclusive education like in the 1970s and 1990s to 1990s in Nigeria, the early 90s? There were very few segregated schools. There were few, condition-specific schools. So you would hear things like the school for the blind or the school for the deaf. There were more institutions, or as we say in Nigerian parlance, homes. So there were a good number of homes for the disabled, right? And interestingly, there were a few transition special schools. So there were a few special schools that focused on being able to transition their learners, right, into mainstream schools after a certain number of years, which is basically after primary school, which is the first 6 years, which we would elementary school basically. So we had, for instance, and these schools actually still exist till date. We had Pacheli School for the Blind, which was a fantastic example in Lagos, Nigeria, where the goal of Pacheli School for the Blind was to prepare their blind students to be able to have the tools and the self-advocacy skills that they would need when they did go into mainstream schools from middle school and high school, and then of course into the universities. Mainstream integration was the norm. It wasn't inclusive education in the sense that we know it today. It was basically just access. It was just saying, you're welcome, right? But the cons was, like, we know that integration does not eliminate discrimination or doesn't necessarily provide access, right? The schools were not willing to alter their systems or methods to meet the needs of the students. It was either you just had to keep up or fail. That was what it was. Actually, by the time I was in school in the 90s, there were a few schools like mine that were beginning to provide accommodations. So while schools were providing accommodations, even in my time, they weren't willing to provide modifications for anything. So you couldn't have, so UDL, what? That didn't exist in our thinking. It wasn't even something that we had heard of at the time. So it was just basically about just, shape up or fail. For the accommodations, a few schools like mine were beginning to be willing to give you extra time to finish your exams, or a scribe if you had difficulty with writing. They were willing to basically go to war with the examinations boards to ensure that they provided accommodations for you to take your high stakes testing and stuff like that. But that was a few private schools that were more open to meeting the needs of students better. That wasn't very mainstream. Moving to the the mid 1990s to early 2000s, there was a serious increase in segregated instruction. So special schools started to spring up everywhere. There was now a rise in even privately owned special schools. And the government also got on the bandwagon and started building more and more special schools. A good number of them were, government sponsored. And a lot of the times when you speak to those who started a lot of the special schools, they started it out of the realization that integration wasn't meeting the needs of their children. A lot of the founders of the privately owned special schools were parents, parents who were exhausted with the failures of the system to meet the needs of their children, and who felt, there has to be a way that my child can be served better. And in doing that, a lot of the special schools, started to spring up. So mainstream schools then decided that since there were now special schools in existence, there was no need for them to try to meet the needs of children with disabilities in their classrooms anymore. So they started to basically say to parents flat out, send your child to a special school. And that was what it was. So that was actually what was going on in 2016 when I got into the space. A lot of the parents who wanted who of course had then seen the cons, right, of the segregated instruction, because the children that started with the whole segregated instruction and stayed in the system had now become adults. But like we know, lack of access to a generalized curriculum, lack of access to, to society, a lot of these adults who spent most of their formative years in segregated instruction settings were finding it difficult to actually cope in society. So a lot of now parents of younger children with disabilities were like, maybe this isn't what I want for my child. And so going forward in, the mid 2000s to date, more parents wanted better. And there was just this big call for more than segregated instruction. A lot of parents did not want segregated instruction anymore. But also, they also didn't want integration that didn't meet the needs of their children anymore. So there was this renewed move towards inclusive education in its authentic form. Thankfully, in 2007, Nigeria as a country rewrote its national policy for education, and inclusive education became a part of our national policy for education. Unfortunately, the what's it called now? The definition of inclusive education in our national policy for education is still integration. So, leaves a lot to be desired. But because parents now know what they want and they're working towards it, we're seeing a lot of private schools. So a lot of parents, just as most of education in Nigeria has been privatized, a lot of parents are gravitating towards private schools and saying, we want the gains of integration with the tools available in special schools for our kids. So we want the best of both worlds, right? Which is really what they're saying is we want inclusive education in the full sense of it. So at this point, universal design for learning is what I like to call an aspirational goal for us. It's something that a number of, private schools are beginning to talk about. It's still quite aspirational. It's still very new. Every time that I do a training for classroom teachers and I pull out a UDL lesson plan framework, I see there's a lot of confusion, right? They're like, what is this? And I'm like, you're going to love this, I promise. And I so basically have to run them through, what is universal design for learning? What is universal design? Thankfully, I come from a family that spends a lot of time in the building industry. So I already knew I knew universal design from architecture. So it was very easy for me to make the transition to say, this is universal design from architecture, but this is how we transition it to learning. And interestingly, when the teachers understand it, they're like, oh, it makes sense to plan my lessons this way because my students would enjoy it better. And so it's still an aspirational goal. It's not something that's mainstream yet. It's things that we're still trying out with a few schools and a few teachers. But we're already seeing the gains when teachers have training, and when teachers have training and they're open to saying, how can we do this better? But the question is, what's been holding us back? Because I mean, we're in 2021, as far back as 1994, UNESCO already said that the best way to educate all children is to educate children inclusively. And, it went back to something that I saw in the presentation that Dr. Judith made about the fact that they're just, it's very, some of these things are very African. They cut across, right? The things like stigmatization of children with disabilities, which is cultural for us and is also very religious, especially in Nigeria. There's a lot of demonization of disability going around. So that, that actually puts a bit of a damper on things. So I've had to, so I'll share some experiences. When working with families and working with schools, right? I remember in the first few years of my work, I've been running the Cerebral Palsy Kids Learn Foundation for 5 years now. And in 2017, when I started, one of the first schools that I spoke to about inclusive education for children with cerebral palsy, she was big on yes, because hey, the proprietor also had a son with cerebral palsy. So she totally understood what I was saying, especially from a parental perspective of how this could serve, this would be great to serve all children. And so when it was just her son, the other parents were fine. The minute that she admitted the second pupil with a disability, she lost 75% of her student enrollment. And when she reached out to the parents to find out why they were pulling out their kids, they all said, oh, well, we don't want our children to catch whatever it is that these kids have, so there was a lot of stigmatization going around. It's better now. In the last 5 years, it's a lot less. I haven't seen it as much as I saw it in my first year. It's getting better. It's still happening, obviously, but at least in the sphere of influence that I work in, it's getting better. And then, of course, like everybody has said across Africa, teacher training is essential. It's one of the big problems that we saw from the very beginning of our work. Because I don't know about other African countries, but because Nigeria segregates teacher training into special education and general education, somehow general education teachers believe that it is only special ed teachers, as in teachers that went to the College of Education Special, that should teach children with disabilities. And so and it's interesting, it's really not their fault. If you didn't go to the College of Education Special, you probably only took one module in passing about disabilities. And so they have no baseline knowledge of what to do when a student doesn't present typically in the classroom. So teacher training is essential. Of course, there's architectural barriers, which is a big thing in almost all schools, even a lot of government-owned schools. Like we said, because buildings were not universally designed from inception, there's a lot of retrofitting that they try to do. And we all know that retrofitting is usually more expensive than building, universally from scratch. So there's always that. And like we said, if the curriculum is rigid, it's going to be hard to meet the learning needs of all children. And that's a big roadblock. Every time that I do trainings for schools, towards the end, it's gotten to a point where I anticipate this question now, and I'm getting to a point where I'm actually having to write an entire manual on how to navigate high stakes testing, because when they're done with the training, the teachers, the school heads, everybody's like, this is great. We could totally do this in school. I mean, we would totally do this. I mean, it's going to serve all our students. All our students are going to do better. This is obvious. But hey, how does this work when it's time for them to do high stakes testing, like the West African Senior Secondary School Certificate, the Common Entrance Examination? How does this work? Because let's even say we provide all of these accommodations and these modifications and reasonable, all of the accommodations and modifications that the children need in the classroom, and they do well while they're here, they still have to take these high stakes tests to progress into, further education and all. So how do we get the accommodations and modifications in high stakes testing? And my answer, which that I've always said, is that we need to get to a critical mass, because if we're going to change the rigid notion around high stakes testing, we need to have a critical mass of students who are requiring and requesting the accommodations and modifications. It's when we've reached critical mass that we're able to then, kind of put pressure on the system to change. However, as we stand, the system does provide accommodations where required. Where requested. If you don't request it, even when they see that you need it, they're still not going to give it to you. So it's important that, the curriculum, we see how the curriculum holds us back from actually reaching our aspirational goal of inclusive education and universal design for learning. And then, like Dr. Judith said, parental cooperation and support for inclusive education is big. If parents don't even understand disability, don't understand their child's needs, and parents cannot be effective advocates for their children, a lot of the times we find out that parents who don't even understand their child's needs have very, very difficult to deal with in an inclusive setting. They're the ones who will not attend the IEP meetings. They're the ones who will not give the school feedback, and they're the ones who expect teachers to perform magic. So it's very important that parents support inclusive education, support inclusive schools, and that they cooperate with the school to help their children reach the goals. And like we said, poverty is a big deal in a lot of cases of children with disability accessing education. So costs is usually a big deal for a lot of families. They struggle with the cost of inclusive education for their children. I mean, usually because of almost all healthcare costs are out of pocket in this part of the world, by the time parents are done paying for medical treatment, therapies, there's little left over for education. So socioeconomic factors become a barrier. So those are the things that are holding us back. So, but what can we do though? Now that we know all the things that are holding us back, what can we do? I always say that inclusive education is something that we all have a role to play in. First of all, we have to start with private heart changing and attitudinal change. We all need to learn to speak up when you hear damaging narratives about people with disabilities, because it's all around us in our spheres of influence. And a lot of the times, these things stem from ignorance. So if you do hear it, which you will, especially if you live in Nigeria, I don't think you can go a week without hearing some kind of, damaging narrative around people with disabilities. Correct it. Educate people, ensure universal design in your sphere of influence. It might not be big, but in whatever sphere of influence that you have, ensure that when buildings are being designed, they're designed in a universal way. An example is this. A few years ago, my church, where I worship, was designing a new auditorium. And I remember going to the head of the building committee and saying, you guys need to think universally in this design. And I said, please consider access for people with mobility impairments. And they were like, we can't afford a lift. And I was like, oh, no, I'm not asking you to put in a lift. There's something called a ramp. A ramp would work for everyone, not just for people with mobility impairments, parents of children or strollers, and, just generally make life easy for everyone. It was a bit of a tall order. I remember having to go back and remind them all the time that the ramp needed to be installed from scratch. Now the building is done. Same thing with even the bathrooms. I kept talking about having, wide access doors to the bathroom for those who may need to use wheelchairs, crutches, or walkers. We had debates over the quality of the tiles and rugs that we had in the rooms and stuff like that. Today, it's interesting that the ramp that we went back and forth over installing is the preferred access entrance to the auditorium by everyone, not just those of us with mobility impairments, but by pretty much everyone who comes into the auditorium. And so it's the door that everyone wants to use. So if you can, whatever sphere of influence that you have, ensure universal design happens in your workplace, in your churches, in wherever places that you have influence. And then, of course, commit to learning and encouraging educators around you to learn about how to support the learning needs of children with disabilities. A lot of educators do not have this training from scratch, like I said, but we can support them and encourage them to learn about supporting the learning needs of children with disabilities, especially by learning about UDL. Trust me, too many teachers, especially in my neck of the woods, I've never heard the term universal design for learning. So if we can make this something that's open to all teachers to learn and to use, we would be improving access to inclusive education. At this point, I will stop here and I'll take questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Toby. That was very insightful. Experience and gives us a lot to chew on. All right, finally, we will just have Alyssa present her research and what her findings were. Alyssa.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes,
Can
yes.
everybody hear me? Yes, okay, great. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay. All right. Whoops. Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay. Let's see, present. All right. Sorry, can you see the whole presentation or the slides all the way on the left as well?
We can see the slides all the way at the left.
Okay, you can, all right. There we go, okay.
Yeah, we're good.
So, okay, great. So my name is Alyssa, and I'm an occupational therapy student at the MGH Institute of Health Professions in Boston, Massachusetts. I've collaborated with Confidence and Ecom of the UDIA, Valerie Fletcher from the Institute of Human-Centered Design in Boston, and my occupational therapy mentor, Diane Smith, to create a scoping review and narrative inquiry regarding the current barriers and facilitators for inclusive education in Western Africa. I chose the entire region of Western Africa to broaden my search and generalize it to reflect the needs of all 17 nations. The overall purpose of my study was to gather resources relevant to addressing the needs of the majority of children with disabilities across Western Africa in the school setting. This research study was also conducted to serve as a resource for the UDIA to support their future construction of their inclusive model school in Nigeria. So before I began my scoping review, I did a background research on the current climate for students with disabilities in Western Africa and found that they're very susceptible to acts of violence and discrimination, as was previously mentioned. The UN does have a treaty called the CRPD that addresses the rights of persons with disabilities in Africa, but there is no mandated policy that really enforces this treaty or protects basic rights. Lastly, I learned through my research and collaboration with members of the UDIA that there is a shortage of resources and adequate learning environments in Western Africa, which, as we all know, has the potential to hinder childhood development. Therefore, my research question was, what is the current state of inclusive education in schools in Western Africa to support occupational performance in students? I chose this question because it really sets the groundwork for future change regarding disability inclusivity in schools. I was also curious to learn the high versus low cost supports and their impact on education. Lastly, occupational performance in this context means how well the students are able to learn in their current school environment. So the two methods used for data collection were a scoping review and a narrative inquiry. The inclusion criteria for the articles used in my scoping review were that they had to be peer reviewed in English, published after the year 2010, and relevant to the research question. I also created a data chart to summarize all 14 of the articles used in this study. And lastly, my research was a qualitative data analysis that compared themes from both the scoping review and the narrative inquiry. So here you can see an example of the article pulled from my data chart that I included in my study. I included the author, place of publication, year of study, study populations, purpose of the study, methodology, outcome measures, and the conclusion. So this particular study looked at Babadow's comprehension therapy, which is a specific method for reading comprehension. And I looked at its effect on students with hearing impairment. The authors found a positive correlation between student comprehension and the use of this method. So basically, this article is a really good example of a no-cost solution for inclusivity in schools, because it includes that multisensory approach that was previously mentioned, the universal design learning principle, through visual, auditory, tactile senses. I think they used imaginary play here. So yeah, it's just a really good multisensory approach to learning that, every student learns differently. So if anyone else is interested in reading through the rest of my data charting table to get more information about the other articles, please let me know and I can send that along to Competence or Ecom, and they can probably email that to you as well. Okay. So the purpose of my narrative inquiry was to hear perspectives from individuals in the Nigerian community to understand their concerns of the school system. Since they're the experts, right? I can do as much research as I want, but I'm not going to get the full idea because I'm not there. So this narrative inquiry was super important and crucial to my project as a whole. So participants included teachers, school administration, students, and parents. And the participants were given 2 weeks to complete this survey. Okay, so here are some narrative inquiry questions that I used. Every question was open-ended to give participants the opportunity to expand on their answers and to really go further into detail about their concerns and experiences. Questions addressed the experience for students with disabilities, the physical condition of schools, and the current available resources for students with disabilities, to name a few. We also asked about peer relationships, staff training, and how COVID-19 has affected education during the navigation into the virtual world and learning at home. And then that final question, what other issues and concerns do you have regarding the school environment for students with disabilities? I really wanted to make sure that if somebody, if I had left anything out, that everyone would have the opportunity to state their concerns. And a lot of people did, so I'm really happy that I included this question. So here are some notable responses from the narrative inquiry. You'll see a trend in negative perspectives about the treatment of students with disabilities, the lack of adequate facilities, and overall lack of teacher trainings, which was previously mentioned in other presentations today. In particular, someone stated students with disabilities are literally forced to make do with the available in response to their satisfaction level with the current facilities. More resources are limited. The structure is not made to accommodate people with disabilities. Others mentioned poor ventilation, poor acoustics, unsanitary restrooms, limited presence of ramps, and overall poor maintenance of the school facilities. So to summarize, there is an overall shared dissatisfaction with the current school climate across the board when it comes to inclusive education. Yeah, structured should be made easy for access and accommodation. Okay, so themes for my research fell into 3 subsections, including advocacy, school staff training, and architecture and the school environment. These themes were most commonly discussed and really implicates the need for change in these areas to see positive results in education for students with disabilities and students in general. So findings from the literature review prove that advocacy is essential for improvements in inclusive education for students with disabilities. A number of studies found that children with disabilities are at an increased risk for cognitive delays when they're removed from the general education setting, which happens frequently all over the world. There is also no legal mandate regarding civil rights and sufficient educational programming for students with disabilities in Western Africa. And lastly, a majority of disability-based violence occurs at the mesosystem and exosystem levels. So the parent, community, teachers, school level. Therefore, advocacy is essential for educating this community about disability rights, which includes parents and caregivers and their understanding of their child's disability. So moving on to the second theme, school staff training, including changing the curriculum to meet the students' needs. So research found that students with disabilities feel more welcomed when they have strong social relationships with their, quote, typically developing peers, which promotes a more inclusive educational environment. One study also found that more than half of the teachers in their sample size had low to moderate understanding of autism spectrum disorder, which is a very prevalent disability across the globe, and the numbers are rising. There's also an absence of special needs schools and private services for children with intellectual developmental disabilities, or IDDs, due to an inadequate understanding of this disability and this lack of staff training. And then lastly, there's an overall lack of trained staff in the field of assistive technology, which can deprive students with disabilities from really reaching their full learning potential. So under the theme of architecture and school environments, researchers found that the physical and social school contexts play a significant role in educational success of students. They also found an abundance of overcrowded schools with inadequate technology and services, such as OT, speech therapy, special education, and physical therapy. Teachers were also found to lack the qualifications for teaching students with disabilities. So the similarity in results from the narrative inquiry responses and the research really supports the strength of these findings. So both researchers and narrative inquiry participants gave a multitude of recommendations for how to improve existing schools to make the environment more inclusive. Some notable recommendations include changing the physical structure of schools to prevent overcrowding and to promote a balanced pupil-teacher ratio, creating both unstructured and structured spaces for students to learn through that multisensory approach that I mentioned before, the visual, tactile, auditory learning styles, implementing specialized classroom technology in schools to support not only students with disabilities, but the entire class as a whole, especially due to the COVID-19 pandemic, given the shift to online learning at home. And then lastly, researchers and narrative inquiry participants also examined or emphasized the need for appropriate school staff trainings on inclusive education, including facilitating positive peer relationships and utilizing their teaching skills to come up with unique and little to no cost strategies for teaching through these multisensory methods. So in conclusion, this research really showed that there's a major need for improvements in school architecture and environments based on these themes and through the narrative inquiry responses as well. These narrative inquiry participants also strengthened and confirmed my research findings regarding an overall dissatisfaction with the lack of resources for students both with and without disabilities in schools throughout Western Africa. So that really emphasizes that need for advocacy, you know, keeping the conversation open about disabilities. You know, as mentioned before, if you hear someone using ableist language, really trying to nip it in the bud, try to get people to start understanding that people with disabilities are people as well. So that's definitely something to think about. And then this consistency in responses and research was a major strength of the research study, while limitations did include a lack of level 1 and 2 research studies, meaning that they were mostly qualitative interviews. And there were also some interruptions due to the current COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to thank everyone for your time and attention, and I would love to answer any questions that you may have at this time. If not, no worries.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, and thank you, Dr. Judith and Tobiloba. It was really interesting listening to all three of you. So at this point in time, I'm going to take questions if you have any. Our facilitators are still here to answer questions, and of course, we, UDIA team too. And if it's a question for us, we're also available to answer. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box or just raise your hand if you'd like to speak. So thank you all so much. So if there are no questions, I mean, it just means that our facilitators did a very good job of explaining universal design for learning and inclusive education. I mean, so thank you all so much. But I'll still give some time if you still have questions. And I'm checking through the chat if there are any questions that I missed. Okay, yes, Shoma, please kindly unmute yourself and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think it was quite excellent presentations and the discussions around that. Very, very key discussions to have at this time. And I want to just thank the presenters for sharing on such critical issues. I think what I have more, it's more of a comment, just to add something to the Nigerian context. What keeps coming to my mind in terms of that? Okay, first just a disclaimer. I know there was something, I think Tobiloba, you said something around it's an African thing. You were talking about stigma. And I just wanted to put out that kind of a disclaimer that I don't think it's an African thing. I understand you talking about culture and how our culture can propagate this stigma, some of what we do within our culture and the belief systems. But actually, nations all over the world have gone through the myth and assumptions and negativity around disability and grown from there. So I would just say that it's time for us to push within our context now in Africa to begin to push and also advance, but it's not, I wouldn't say exactly it's an African thing in particular, just to respond to that. And then I absolutely agree with you when you talk about also the Nigerian context, you talk about the experiences and how it's kind of an ideal inclusion right now. inclusive education is more of an ideal that people talk about, and it's so yet to be achieved. I agree with that. I just want to link the Nigerian context, your discussion, Tobiloba, just want to link it to this idea of the positioning of the female person, the female body within our culture. So within the Nigerian setting, and I trained as a special teacher in University of Ibadan. And so I was trained as a special educator for children with intellectual disabilities and taught in special schools in Ibadan. And I absolutely relate to what you're saying around the level of segregation and discrimination. And it's almost like nothing has changed, listening to people talk about it, which is quite appalling. But one thing that stuck with me from that experience is how the child with a disability is very much left to the women, to the mother, to the aunt, to the grandmother. It's almost not men's business. And so I found out that there's almost a twin approach. So when I taught in those schools, I had the twin track approach where I talked to mothers, because I realized that the liberation of their children will not come as easily if the mothers in particular, because they were left to be primary caregivers. And some of them were chased out of their home with this child. And that positioning, I think, is something that we really need to address as well. The positioning of the female body within our culture and how this impacts on the lived experience of our children with disabilities. When the woman is disempowered, the fight is twice as long to get her child to a space where the child can assess what the child needs. So almost just to ask around, if around the discourse of inclusive education and the training around that, if we are speaking, it would be good to speak across organizations who work with women, and that kind of discussion across, just to support the women who support these children at home. Because when the woman is oppressed, a woman that is oppressed will not find the strength to do what must be done for her child. An example is in my community, for instance. If you come in to do anything to talk to women need to get permission from their husbands. That happens till today as I'm talking here. They need to get permission from their husbands to go. And if the man is not impressed with what will be discussed, they will often refuse. So we still have that happening. And that is where I really fight with these cultural stipulations we have. Because at the end of the day, the child with a disability gets caught in the middle. I know there are mothers who really want to do so much more, but they can't. So just that speaking across silos and seeing if there's a way that we carry, especially within the Nigerian context, we carry mothers along as well, as much as we can, because they are often particularly impacted by the disability and the impairment that their children carry. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Choma. Thank you for that comment. Very, very interesting. So we have 2 questions, actually 3 questions in the chat box. So how can, and any one of our facilitators can take this, please, because we have just one that is directed to Alyssa. So the first question, how can education be inclusive in developing countries, especially those lacking basic classroom resources? So
my best response is advocacy. Really, that's the main idea here, is to get the conversation going about inclusive education, speaking to government representatives, getting the words out, really trying to educate, starting with your family, expanding to your communities, expanding to the government. Really, that's how change is made. And that's the best. I mean, I understand that people are lacking basic classroom resources. So, you're not going to be able to get specialized technologies, but I think a good starting point is advocacy and keeping that conversation open about change.
So my position is always that in resource-sparse countries, especially in, and I'll use Nigeria as a case study. Like I said, when I was starting my organization, I mean, people kept saying, oh, it's sad that you have to do this. This is something government should do. And I was like, you know what? We can't keep waiting for government because the children are not getting any younger. I mean, these children that we're looking to serve are going to keep getting older, and they're going to, they need these services today. And so what I say to schools, and I say to, educators in very low resource communities where I serve, is to say, look, it starts in your mind. If you believe that you can find the resources, you can curate, even if, it doesn't have to be perfect. Like I always say, it doesn't have to be fancy. It just has to work. So for instance, I'll give an example. There's one of our kids who goes to a school, who is integrated in a mainstream school in a low-income community. As per usual, the school was architecturally inaccessible in the sense that there were stairs in front of her classroom. Now, she uses a wheelchair, so that was going to be a bit of a challenge, just access into the classroom, not even just, we haven't even gotten to the learning, just being able to get into class was going to be a challenge, right? And we then had a conversation with the school to say, is there a way that we can work around this? And I remember that we literally created a makeshift ramp out of plywood. It was basically plywood. It was very cheap. It was readily available in that community. And we created a ramp out of plywood, literally, to first, let's facilitate access. This child hasn't even been able to get into the classroom. So there's always, there are always solutions if we're willing to think outside the box. So for instance, I remember a child we had who obviously needed some kind of support. I mean, this would, now that I think about it, simple pencil grip was all this child needed to be able to grip a pencil properly and be able to write in class. But they couldn't access that. So what did the teacher do? The teacher took paper tape and, wound paper tape around the pencil enough till it created the bulk that the student needed, so that their pencil grip was supported, so they could use the pencil. So it's always about, yes, the resources, the ideal resources are not there, but can we improvise with what is available? Once you're committed to teaching a child, no matter the resources you have. I mean, I have an entire book on home-based therapeutic interventions from things you have in your house. I remember because my parents had to do this. I grew up in Nigeria, so my parents did this all the time. We didn't have access to all of the fancy technology that was available. So for simple things like, I mean, my parents had to teach me pencil grip, they had me cutting up paper, and it had to be newspaper because you couldn't cutting up real like notebook paper because that was expensive. So it had to be like discarded newspaper and leaves from like trees and stuff. So it's always just finding adaptations to say, what does this child need right now? And what can we use in our setting to make this available while we're waiting for government and all of the other things that need to be in place? So we always have to find low cost solutions, and they exist around us. And I always say this to classroom teachers, your biggest allies are in that classroom. They are the peers of this child. If you're struggling with finding a way to support a specific need, ask the other students. Children know more than we give them credit for, and they're fantastic at innovation, especially around things that they already have in the class. They'll figure it out even faster than you will as an adult. So the truth is that if you have very few resources, use the resources that you do have, the other students in the classroom and whatever is around you. There'll always be something you can adapt with.
I think it's important to remember that multisensory approach that was also mentioned, the universal design through learning. So if you're trying to teach reading comprehension to children, you can do it in a play-based way. You can do storytelling, role play, tactile, anything, any kind of, utilizing more than one sense. So touch, hearing, vision, things like that as well.
Yeah, I think if I can come in there as well, I want to support Alyssa in that. And I think that one shouldn't begin to think of universal design for learning as necessarily being a high-tech thing. It's not necessarily. It is about the principles and how you actually use the principles to plan for your lessons and to plan how you're going to present your information, how you're going to assess it, and how you're going to engage with learners. So I think that's one thing that's really important. I think also that we need, there's a need for flexibility, and that is really, really works against inclusive education, a rigid curriculum. I think in terms of like the high stakes testing that somebody also mentioned, and how that works against disability, we do need policies. We do need enabling policies that will support learners in inclusive education, as well as their teachers, as well as their parents. And the other thing I feel is just really important is looking after the teachers. It's understanding not only their training needs, but also sometimes their support needs. There's evidence to show that when teachers are required to implement inclusive education without support, they can actually become more negative and feel even let down. So there is a real need for like a team approach, and that can happen in any community. So I think it's what I'm trying to say is there's a grassroots, there's a bottom up level that needs to happen, but there is also a top down in terms of policy. And we are, and that's where the advocacy comes in as well, because we do have the tools for advocacy. We know we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, which we are committed to globally. And then also the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which I see has also been a mention in the chat. Article 24 refers specifically to inclusive education. And it is actually quite specific on what that should look like and how that should be done. Now, many countries, many African countries, I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but many African countries have signed and ratified the convention. So that's another thing that can be used for lobbying. I think those are some of the thoughts that one can bring in low-income countries that could promote inclusive education. It isn't only about resources.
Thank you very much for that. I think we have one more question from Colette, who is asking about policy and being able to advocate as a group. Sorry, I'm no more able to see that question. Okay, yes, found it. Is there a way we can use the UN CRPD, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to further the rights of persons with disabilities in general, including education? And then there's a follow-on question on that, saying, you know, as with all most policies and legislations, inclusive and accessible education should be enforced. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Judith.
Well, I think just as I mentioned that, I think that the convention is a powerful tool for advocating and for developing a strategy on how to work with inclusive education. And you know, every country has the opportunity to report on the convention. The non-governmental organizations also have an ability to are enabled to report to the committee on progress in their own countries. So I think if one looks at the two documents that I think are very helpful, that I'd recommend that people look at that can help us at this stage. The one is the GEM report that I've mentioned, the Global Education Monitoring Report, which relates very closely to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the other document that I think is really a useful one is the general comment of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2016. It's a general comment on inclusive education. And for me, both of those are important because thinking of the twin track approach, the UNCRPD really gives a disability inclusive perspective, and the GEM report gives a broader perspective. So I think they go together quite well and give some kind of frameworks and parameters to start thinking about inclusive education. So I think the UNCRPD is essential. We really need to be using it.
Thank you very much, Judith. And thank you everyone for making this conversation very interactive. We have to close this because we have time. And thank you very much, Dr. Judith, Tobiloba, and Alyssa. Yes, this session was recorded and the recording will be shared with all participants either today or tomorrow. And then we'll also share the slides, where we also will include some links to some of the resources that have been mentioned during this meeting. Thank you all very much. We will keep in touch as regards other UDI events around universal design and inclusive education. Do have a wonderful afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you all so much.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
All right, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.